Welcome. This lecture we're going to talk about reproduction and different reproductive strategies. Why do animals put so much effort into survival? Everything we're talking about in physiology is how an animal survives. And what's the point of all that? What's the end game? In the wild, the whole point of survival is to pass on your genetic material, to make yourself a plus one. If you don't pass on your genetic material, you aren't contributing to the next generation. So reproduction is really the whole point of survival in the animal kingdom. Most animals put an enormous amount of resources into ensuring their genetic material will be represented in the next generation. Some animals put a lot of resources into producing many offspring in hopes that a few will survive. Others will have few offspring and devote their resources to rearing those young to ensure survival. Both of these strategies can be successful. They're just different ways about going about it. The first strategy of having a lot of offspring is what we call an R-selected reproductive strategy. And this entails having a lot of offspring and hoping that a few survive. And generally, the offspring are what we consider inexpensive offspring because you're just trying to mass produce a lot. So each one can't take too many resources from the parent. Otherwise, the parent wouldn't survive. An example of an R-selected animal would be spiders. Spiders can have hundreds of eggs, but they don't put much effort into those eggs once they hatch. Sometimes they'll take care of the eggs, right? They'll try to keep them warm like other animals do, or they'll keep them oxygenated like octopus do in octopus's den. Some animals will take care of their eggs, but once the eggs hatch, generally the young are going to be surviving on their own. And you can see here a few examples. So crabs, the mother will actually hold on to all of the eggs. These are all the eggs here in a brood pouch, and this is called the telson, holding it all together. Turtles, they'll go onto a beach, lay hundreds of eggs, and then the mother will leave and not have any involvement with those eggs at all. And again, spiders that we mentioned. Many marine invertebrates do something what we call mass spawning, where they will release lots of eggs and sperm into the water and hope that a few of them find each other and produce an offspring. Again, these are going to be pretty inexpensive offspring, what we consider inexpensive. Again, many offspring with little investment, rapid development generally in the juveniles, so they become adults easily, quickly, and pretty rapid reproductive cycles. So sometimes animals can reproduce several times in one season, but generally pretty rapidly. These animals, these types of reproductive strategies do best in areas where there are periods of abundant resources. Think about like a desert. When it rains, there's a lot of food availability, so there's abundant resources there. But other times of the year, it's very arid and not a lot of food, and so these animals would do best in that type of environment. These are what we call variable environments. So they're not very predictable and they can change either seasonally or annually. Again, there's going to be little to no parental care once the eggs hatch. Sometimes there's parental care taking care of the eggs and ensuring survival of the eggs, but once those eggs hatch, there's generally no care. And again, the examples that we gave, many of the invertebrates, spiders, squid, and sea turtles. The second type of strategy is what we call K-selected reproductive strategies. And this is, again, going to have more investment into the offspring, fewer offspring. Generally, these are going to be longer-lived animals, and they're also going to have longer developmental and reproductive cycles. These animals will generally live in a more predictable environment, and some examples of these: humans, most mammals, birds. Here's my brood here. But think about it, they are going to have few offspring And there's going to be a lot more investment from the parents to rear those young until they're old enough to survive on their own. And sometimes they live home forever. They never leave home, right? They stay at home forever, which that's okay too sometimes. Again, these animals are going to have few offspring. You can see the sloth here with her baby, just one. Dolphins generally just have one calf. Lions have a few cubs, but not too many. But they generally work together. They have more of a cooperative parenting strategy. And then humans, we generally have one. Sometimes you can have twins or triplets, but it's not the norm. Some animals can reproduce asexually without combining the genetic material from two individuals. This is through two different means, either binary fission or budding. Binary fission is when an animal actually elongates and divides in half. And sea anemones are a great example of that. Their bodies will elongate and then they will divide in the middle and become two sea anemones. Other animals can divide through something called budding. Budding is when an animal develops a bud that eventually breaks away from the parent and it can live on its own. And you can see that down here. This is called a hydra. It's a type of animal in the ocean. And they develop these little buds. It almost looks like a little adult stuck to the parent organism. And that little bud will grow until it becomes mature. And then it'll break off and live on its own. Corals and jellies can reproduce through budding, and in both cases, the original animal, the parent animal, is getting its genetic material into the next generation, but there's no new genetic mixing in these offspring. They're genetically identical to the original parent. This strategy is beneficial to sessile animals, so animals that can't move, like barnacles, and they can't find mates. But it's also physiologically inexpensive to reproduce asexually because the animals don't waste any time or energy producing eggs and sperm. And they also don't have to expend any energy finding a mate. So animals looking to colonize an area rapidly may be best served through asexual reproduction. Think about corals. Corals are trying to build that whole reef structure rapidly. So corals will reproduce asexually to build up that coral, the coral reef. But then at some point they will start to divide and produce eggs and sperm and reproduce sexually. And coral would be an example of a mass spawner that we talked about. While asexual reproduction fulfills the end game of ensuring your genetic material makes it into the next generation, it isn't always healthy for a population. Genetic mixing allows for new genes to get into that next generation. So sexual reproduction is really important at some point to make sure that there is some genetic mixing in the new generation. But for areas that an organism is trying to rapidly colonize, asexual reproduction is a great strategy for a short period of time. If you are ever walking in the tide pools right here in Santa Barbara, you'll notice that there's a lot of rocks covered in anemones, and they're called aggregating anemones. And these aggregating anemones will also divide through asexual reproduction through binary fission, and they will divide rapidly and they'll fill in that whole rock pretty rapidly. And if you look at the rock closely, sometimes you can see some demarcations between some of the aggregating anemones. And so a whole clump of those aggregating anemones will all be genetically identical. And then you'll see that demarcation, and then that next clump will be a different genetically identical, genetically different from the first clump, but genetically identical to themselves in the second clump. Whatever the strategy, asexual or sexual, hormonal regulation is integral to all reproduction. Asexual reproduction is under hormonal regulation just as much as sexual reproduction is. Most invertebrates' endocrine system is under neuronal hormonal regulation, and that means that the nervous system is regulating the release of hormones. Some invertebrates will be hermaphroditic. They'll be both male and female at the same time. And some others will experience sex changes where they start as one gender and develop into the other gender. Both systems are still under hormonal control, and some invertebrates will only mate one time in their life and die after reproduction, really highlighting the importance of the end game, the whole goal in life, passing on the genetic material. Some invertebrates will develop secondary reproductive structures to assist in the production of eggs or sperm. We mentioned this brood pouch in the crab here, and that's a secondary structure developed during the time when this animal is going to rear its eggs. Again, this is going to be under hormonal control, and these reproductive structures are generally seasonally grown, and they'll regress once breeding is complete. Egg development, as well as egg sacs or egg cases, may require chemicals and hormonal processes to complete. This requires enormous energetic demand on these animals, these invertebrates. Hormones are often species specific, as well as the different compounds used to carry out each of these different processes. As with all previous topics, reproduction in animals is different amongst the different taxa, and it's incredibly vast in its processes, and we're going to talk about that. The majority of animals are going to reproduce through sexual reproduction, using gametes, the eggs and the sperm. And this is when a sperm of an individual fuses with the egg of a different individual to produce a zygote. The sperm provides half of the genetic material, and the egg provides the other half. The zygote is a fertilized egg that begins dividing and develops into an animal. Fertilization of the egg can either be external or internal. Obviously, external is going to be outside the body, and internal is going to be inside the body. Many fish, aquatic invertebrates, amphibians are going to have external fertilization. This only works when the male and female release their eggs or sperm into the water at the same time. So water is integral for this process. Some populations will release eggs and sperm at once, and this is called spawning, which we mentioned previously, that mass spawning. You can see some examples of animals that will conduct mass spawning. These nudibranchs here. Here's a solitary anemone, mussels. So a lot of your sessile marine invertebrates are going to do what we call mass spawning, but not all sessile animals. Even animals that can move will also mass spawn, and a lot of times, like urchins, will have a mass spawning event, usually around a high tide and a full moon, and they will all kind of move towards each other. So a mass spawning migration, and release their eggs and sperm into the water at that time, and then there's a better chance that those eggs and sperm will find each other because the parents, the moms and the dads, the males and the females will all be closer to each other. Internal fertilization is when the sperm is deposited in or near the female reproductive tract, and the egg and the sperm will fuse somewhere in the tract. This is especially important for terrestrial animals that reproduce outside of water. Internal fertilization ensures the gametes will stay in a moist environment suitable for survival. The process of depositing the sperm usually requires copulation, where the male and the female must come together for a period of time. Some animals will have elaborate courtship rituals and spend significant amount of time together, while others will copulate and separate rapidly. Invertebrates like squid and octopus are going to transfer sperm in packets called spermatophores using a specialized tentacle called a hectocotylus. Sharks also use spermatophores and insert them into the female using special fins called claspers. Male and female birds touch their cloaca. Their cloaca is their urogenital opening, so birds only have one opening for everything, reproduction and waste elimination, and it's called a cloaca. And when they touch them together, they will transfer sperm while they are together. You can actually see that happening here. These butterflies are touching their cloacas together and reproducing. Male mammals use a penis inserted into the female vagina to deposit his sperm. All methods accomplish internal fertilization, but they require different anatomy. Here you can see elephant seals copulating, and here is a gray whale trying to copulate with a female gray whale right next to him. Both external and internal fertilization require timing as well. Just because the sperm is deposited doesn't mean the egg will be fertilized. To begin with, an egg needs to be present, which means the female must have ovulated, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Once the egg and the sperm come together, there's a few different strategies for how they are handled with the animal. Oviparity is one strategy where an animal is going to release eggs. Some oviparous animals lay eggs and leave, while others will have some level of parental care for their eggs, which we talked about just a bit ago. Some animals are in between these two strategies where they'll create a safe space for the eggs, like a nest or an egg case, and then they'll leave them there, investing some energy into the survival of the eggs, but not too much energy. Some oviparous animals will only lay their eggs if a male is around. If not, the female will retain the eggs, and on some occasion they'll be reabsorbed. There are also many reproductive behaviors regulated with gonadal hormones. Many oviparous animals, like birds and crabs, will also produce behavioral displays, dances, and songs or changes in their color patterns to announce their reproductive readiness. These are going to be regulated through testosterone and estrogen levels, and they're going to be produced seasonally. Birds have specialized mechanisms for egg production. In most cases, only the bird's left ovary will produce eggs. The egg that is released from the ovary during ovulation will travel down the oviduct, and this will eventually become the yolk of the egg. Birds have several regions to their oviduct. The first area is the infundibulum, and you can see that way up top here. Here's the ovary at the very top here, and then here is this area that is going to catch that egg, that infundibulum. If the egg is going to become fertilized, it would happen in this region here. But the bird will still lay the egg if it doesn't become fertilized. Obviously, right? A lot of us have eaten chicken eggs before, and they're not all fertilized. As the egg travels down the tract, layers of protein called albumin are going to be added. And you can see they have this very convoluted track here where that egg is going to travel. The next section is called the isthmus, and this is where two outer membranes are formed. And you can see that down at the bottom of this tract here. The outermost layer will become the shell, and the egg grows and swells with water and salts. The egg is then going to enter the shell gland, which is also the uterus down here, and that's where the shell will be calcified, and then finally the egg will be laid through the cloaca. You can see on this image here, this is where the large intestine also feeds into that cloaca. Remember, they only have one urogenital opening here. Some animals, such as sharks, skates, rays, and beetles, are what we call ovoviviparous. This is where the eggs remain inside the animal and the eggs are hatched inside the body. The young exit the body alive, not in an egg. This is different from viviparity in that the animals don't have a placenta, so they're what we call aplacental. And all of the nutrients needed to develop the embryo are inside the egg at the time the egg is developed. There's no parental investment in the young while they are gestating, other than the shelter for the development to occur. Viviparity is where an animal gives birth to a live young. These embryos are provided nutrients through a placenta during development. Whether animals are oviparous, where they lay eggs, viviparous, where they're giving birth to live young, or ovoviviparous, they maintain the eggs internally and give birth to the live young, ovulation, what is egg production, is very similar. And ovulation is one of the first stages of reproduction, but many stages of reproduction are going to include timing. And again, a lot of it is all under hormonal control. Some animals will have distinct breeding seasons, while others are reproductively active year-round. Animals can use internal circadian clocks to time their breeding season, or they can rely on photoperiod, so the amount of day length, to adjust their timing for their breeding cycle. Gonadotropins are hormones that released from the pituitary gland that stimulate reproductive hormone secretion from the ovaries and the testes. These hormones can be regulated by many factors that regulate reproductive cycles and timing. Environmental factors can have significant impact on reproduction. Temperature, photoperiod, food availability, and other factors can determine the gender of the offspring, reproductive timing, and whether animals will even mate. Animals employ many strategies to ensure that all of their reproductive efforts will pay off. They put so much resources into reproduction. They want it to be successful. Many species, including arthropods, amphibians, reptiles, sharks, and birds, will store sperm in utero until reproductive timing is ideal. These animals can store viable sperm for days up to years and rely on it for fertilization when the timing is right. Other animals, such as many arthropods, turtles, fish, birds, and mammals, experience something called embryonic diapause. This is where the egg is fertilized, but the development does not occur immediately. Instead, there is a pause in the development where the egg remains in the blastocyst stage. And we'll talk about that. The blastocyst is right after that zygote is formed. The egg is going to start to divide, and that's called the blastocyst stage. Some egg-laying insects use this strategy if they are laying eggs at the end of the summer or in the autumn when the offspring won't have enough time to grow before temperatures drop. These eggs are pre-programmed to require a period of very cold temperatures before development resumes, and that's a strategy used in the silk moth. So they will lay their eggs at the end of summer into autumn, and then there is this period of diapause here during winter where the eggs experience a period of cold temperature, and then those eggs will hatch out in the spring. And this ensures that those eggs are going to develop once the ambient temperatures rise enough to support the survival of the offspring. Some mammals also have something called delayed implantation, which is a period of embryonic diapause. This is usually found in animals that congregate during the breeding season, where the males and females come together for a purpose of breeding. But then they generally disperse after that, where they're not going to encounter each other again. In these animals like seals, sea lions, and walruses, the embryonic development is less than a year. But it's important for the offspring to be born on the breeding grounds where the conditions are ideal for survival. Therefore, the animals will mate while together on the breeding grounds, but the embryo does not implant until a period of time later. The endometrium, the lining of the uterus, is not receptive for the embryo to implant until a surge of estrogen is released from the ovaries at a later time. Once the endometrium is ready, the embryo will implant and gestation will start. All of these strategies ensure the mother has access to enough resources to support the energetic demands of reproduction and the conditions will support the survival of the young. You can see this as another example here in this Antarctic fur seal. They are going to mate in the spring, but then they have this period during the summer of diapause, that delayed implantation, and then the egg will implant in the endometrium and placental development will begin in the autumn. Therefore, the offspring will be ready to be born in the spring when the female is back on the breeding grounds. Males can also exert some control over reproductive success, but generally the females are the picky ones, not the males. Some animals are capable of sperm competition, which can be carried out in several different ways. Some animals will place a copulatory plug after they have deposited their sperm, so no other males can fertilize the female. Some others deliver special proteins that can cause rapid fertilization of the egg, so no other sperm can fertilize it. Others partition their sperm release so that they can try to fertilize many females without having to wait between them. Some males will produce lots of sperm and try to flush out the sperm of other males that may have come before him. Other males will guard females. This is happening here. This bison is guarding this female with this calf and waiting for her to come back into estrus so that he can breed with her again. Here you can see a very large testy in a male dolphin. In dolphins, their testes will grow during the breeding season and regress to about 1/10 the size during the non-breeding season. And this is so that that male can produce and store a lot of sperm when the females come into estrus. This is just an example of a few of the many strategies in the animal kingdom, but you can see how important reproduction is to animals. Because reproduction is so important for animals, it's really stressful for males. Because remember, the females are picky, the males are generally not. So the males are in a lot of competition to try to get their sperm into the next generation. The females are guaranteed that their eggs are going to make it into the next generation. The males are not guaranteed that. Therefore, the females can be more picky. They can try to choose the strongest of their breed, of their species. They can try to choose the best looking. Whichever mate is most important for survival, the females can seek that out and search for that for their mates. This is from a study I've conducted, and this is really interesting. There's two graphs here, and this is looking at the total body content of testosterone and cortisol through a body tissue that we analyzed, and you can separate out the layers of the years. It's called the earplug. I'll talk about it later. But you can separate out the layers, and every year you can measure how much testosterone and cortisol this animal produced. This is in a blue whale, and you can see that the testosterone levels are pretty low here, and then they peak at about 9.5 or 10 years of age, and that's when the animal became sexually mature. The animal ended up dying at 11, and that's how we collected this earplug and sampled it. This bottom graph here is showing you the internal levels of cortisol, which is a stress hormone. Animals produce cortisol when they're under a lot of stress. And you can see here throughout the years, there are periods of stress and less stress, maybe associated with feeding or fasting or whatever was going on in the animal's life. But you can see the cortisol peaks at the same time the testosterone peaks because mating is stressful. It's not a coincidence that the cortisol and the testosterone peaked at the same time. For males, mating is stressful.